Okay. Okay. So the shiur this week is, in essence, a continuation of what we began discussing the previous week, which I began with an overview of the quote-unquote activist camps that we hear about in today's day and age. The two camps essentially that take the opposite side in marital disputes when the marriage is going down the tubes, and it's very possible to get radicalized and take the woman's side, perhaps in every case, or vice versa. And I mentioned that by way of introduction to an interesting sefer I came across that was published in the last 20 years, the sefer B'Magli Tzedek, which, as I described, is essentially a 400-page sefer that very methodically is laying out an argument, a detailed halachic argument for the men's side, for the men's rights, in a case in which the marriage seems to be completely to have reached its the end of the functional part of the marriage, and it's just a matter of fighting out the details of how it's going to be drawn down and liquidated, and for all practical purposes, there's no functional marriage at the moment. And the main argument is that the husband should have the right to marry a second time, and the sefer is essentially trying to normalize that from a halachic perspective, from a psak, an actual psak perspective, and additionally from a social, frum perspective. Now, in addition to familiarizing ourselves with these particular arguments, and I already emphasized that this is not in any way taking a particular side, it just happens to be that this sefer with these arguments happens to exist, and I think it's interesting to take a look at. But like I said last time as well, there's a benefit to approaching the sugya. You're able to approach the sugya and get the yesodis and the different nekudas and details. There's a benefit to approaching it in this particular way because, sure, there's Encyclopedia Talmudis, there's Cherem demystified Gershom, you could probably open that up and get a lot of information. But what's interesting about this presentation is that this person is trying to find all the holes, find all the weaknesses, probe all the weaknesses in what is seemingly the accepted halachic status quo. And of course, as from people, our instinct probably correctly is not to look to undermine what appears to be the accepted halacha, especially in serious matters such as these. But maybe specifically for that reason, it might be interesting to hear the perspective of someone who's decided to sort of break out from that bubble and reconsider all the facts anew. And again, like I said last time, you don't even have to take his word for it. You don't have to trust the maskanas that this person is presenting. There might be other sources, other sides of the argument, but I just think that it's a nice way to get a grasp on a lot of the yesodis here, even if you don't accept the actual arguments, l'maaseh, or even in theory. So last time we focused a bit on his introduction, pir v'rivya, the idea that a man could also be an ogun, the nekuda from the Rosh, that Cherem demystified Gershom came to equalize the two sides, not to give the woman more power than the man. And since the author was a Sephardi, so we ended up talking about the Tanai and the Shavua in the Sephardi Ksubis and the concept of polygamy in general. And we went off a bit onto that in the light of some of the details that Rabbi Bar Shalom writes at length in his Sefer Mishpat HaKsubah. So now, getting back to where we left off. So from page 29 to 147, to about 120 pages, he goes on and on about the Shavua. He's looking for holes in the taikif of this Shavua that the Sephardim make. And in fact, if you look in the Sefer Mishpat HaKsubah itself, you'll notice, if you go through the lengthy chapters, you'll see that Rabbi Shalom himself points a lot of these things out, even though seemingly he doesn't have an agenda specifically to undermine the Shavua. In fact, he's here to strengthen every detail in the Ksubah. But just along the way, in the course of discussion, points to all kinds of problematic aspects to this Shvuah. And it seemed like his conclusion was, and I already mentioned it briefly last time, that in today's slang, it's mostly about the vibes. You know, the vibes of saying, oh, there's a Shvuah, you think you're getting married, you're not, this means that you're committing to this marriage. Don't immediately think that it's your Sephardi, it's the rest of the world is still available to you. So it's about the message that it sends rather than an actual legal mechanism. And so according to Bar Shalom, Lav Dafka, the Shavua actually has any strong nafka mina per se. That was even from Rabbi Bar Shalom's perspective. So this is what this individual as well is arguing at perhaps greater length and far more emphatically, that the Shavua indeed isn't binding, certainly not in situations like these. And the truth is that we could go through the noisim and the sub-discussions. We can turn this into a multi-part shiur and shtelzich on every prat, because there are a lot of interesting, fascinating details along the way, Gdarim and Shvuah, etc. We can examine his sources and see what other sources say, but I don't like to, never really like to take one topic and drag it out over too many halakim. So we're going to try to be mitzamtzim here, and in this shiur, we're going to try to go through the rest of what this sefer covers. So just to summarize his arguments on Shavuot very briefly, so you just have an idea of the topics there in case they're of interest to you. His arguments essentially are that even if you committed yourself with a Shavuot, and even if you included that the Shvuah is binding, even in a case of Einus, there's still a halachic yesod to argue and say, to make a distinction between an expected Einus and an unexpected Einus. And the situation in which the marriage is on the rocks because the woman walked out, that would not be included in the Shvuah. So that's one argument he makes. Then he starts getting very technical. He says, what made the Shvuah a Shvuah? You're calling it a Shvuah. It says in the Ksuba, Ani Nishba, whatever the Lashon was, does writing something on a paper make it a Shvuah? Where did he accept the Shvuah? Where did he make the Shvuah? So we can zagen that the Shvuah is a tkiyas kaf. There's a handshake. Who shakes whose hand? The chassan shakes the person who's reading the Ksuba's hand. So the chassan's not getting up and saying, I swear. They read the Ksuba and he does the handshake afterwards. So first of all, he says the machlekes, if a Shavuah through a tkiyas kaf, where you announce the Shavuah and say, okay, now we're going to shake our hands to that, whether that's even considered a Shavuah. And b'chalal rachasana, you announce that the chassan's swearing and he's taking an oath, but everyone sees that he's not swearing, and half the time he has no idea what's going on, and even if he did the handshake, it was just ceremonial, and it goes at great length in this direction. Another point he makes is, you're going to say, oh, the Shavuah is b'ksav. Can you be nishma b'ksav if you write an oath on paper and then sign it? Write it and sign it, or just sign it in this case. In this case, the chassan only signs it. So there's a lot to say about that. Also, the idea that the Shavuah is written b'lashon avar, he swore. When did he swear? When's he swearing? He has arguments about that. So that anyway, the tkiyas kaf, even if the tkiyas kaf were to work, it would only work if the chassan and kala shook hands directly. You can't have a third party. That in particular I found interesting. That would be, in theory, we can go off and talk about that at some greater length. Discusses the idea of the kinyan. They make a kinyan as well. Is the kinyan helping their case? Not. B'chalal, there's one of the Paiskim not too long ago, one of the Sephardi Paiskim argued that B'chalal, the Shavuah and the Ksuba is referring to all the parts of the Ksuba. The main part of the Ksuba everyone knows is the financial obligations. So that Paisik said that you're already chayiv in Shir Ksus V'ayna Midiraisa, so you can't be nishba on something that's already Midiraisa. So Mele, for that reason alone, the whole Shavuah is Nishkin Shavuah, so that means the Shavuah wouldn't be good for the other pratim either, he argues. And then the author goes off into the discussion of the possibility of how being matter the Shavuah, what would that entail, and has a lot to say on that, but that's just to give you a very, very, very quick sense of what that discussion looks like. But then from page 148 and on, for about 200 pages, this is where he discusses, where he tackles Cherem de Gershom according to his mahalach. So this I'm going to go through a bit more slowly. We're just going to try to summarize his argument over 200 pages. So first he starts off by introducing what's the Cherem, where's the Cherem from, right? So we mentioned last time that there's this idea of the Soif Elef HaChamishi, which is around the year, 12 something. So Rabbi Gershom didn't live that much longer before that, about 200 years before the end of Elef HaChamishi. That's when Rabbi Gershom's takanas would have been made. The first record we have of any of these takanas are 100 years later. The information that we have, he points out, is pretty spotty. Not a lot of details as to what the reason is, and how the Cherem works, what the mechanism for the Cherem is. A lot of details were very, very scarce on many details from the source. And B'chalal, they write there's two pratim in Cherem de Gershom. When we say Cherem de Gershom, I think we tend to usually mean be'ikr, not marrying a second wife, but essentially there are two ikr parts, not being megayish bal karcha, and not marrying a second one, which have a similar effect. They're there to strengthen the woman's right in the marriage. So what if someone goes ahead and is megayish bal karcha? That's perhaps a stronger question. Is the get kosher or is the get not kosher? How strong is the Cherem? Let's test the Cherem. We're megayish. He quotes a whole long list of paiskim from the Ramah through the debunked, Rabbi Kiva down to the Marsham, that the get would be good. Rabbi Gershom doesn't have the power to be Eiker Gittin. However you want to explain it, either that wasn't part of the Cherem, or the Cherem can't be that strong, whatever it is, most paiskim that he quotes, he argues, he claims, say the get would be b'teikef. Says, there's a miyot, the Chasam Sefer, Shalomeshev say, no, actually the get is possible. Okay. Okay, say it. Next, so what taka is the reason? So that's an interesting discussions. We'll go into that a bit more in detail here. So what's the reason? So Rabbi Gershom didn't really, from whatever little we have, there is no stated reason. So the Rashba says, Shlei asa el ligdar b'fnei hapritzim v'hahoilim ha'ma'oilim b'nesheseyim shaloi karoi. This is the Marik quoting the Rashba. So the idea was there are men that are acting inappropriately, and we want to put them in check, we want to stop them. That's how Marik quotes the Rashba, articulating the idea behind it. You have others that stated a bit differently. Chashash ktata. There's a Ran, the Tshuva of the Ran says, we want to try to minimize disputes, because if a husband had this right, that would exacerbate disputes. It could even motivate disputes. The husband knows what power he has. So that's another. The Mordechai also Mishum Ktata. So there's that school of thought. Then. Now, some of you may have heard or come across, there's a different idea out there. That it's mamish pashut mishum chashash, that once a man has two wives, once he has two families, a brother might come to marry their sister, right? Because siblings obviously who grew up in the same home should know of each other. But when a man has two families and two homes, so who's to say that a brother might not come to marry their sister? So I was talking to someone this week, they mentioned that, isn't that the Vart? So where does that idea come from? That idea comes from the Mishkenes Yaakov. Mishkenes Yaakov is a name that you might be familiar with by now from Erevin. Not too long ago, about 200 years ago, Litva Shirav. Mishkenes Yaakov says that Ilu Hayir Rishus Biyad Kol Adam Laharbis Nashim Vade Haysa Bezet HaKala Hayanoise Isha Hayem B'Makim Zeh L'Macher B'Makim Acher Bli Soim Leiva L'Isser Amr B'Zeh Me'atayra. we're going to talk about later about the chalal. There is talk in Simon Beis. It says you're not allowed to marry more than one woman in different places. The chalal. So it's a siyag l'isr Torah, and this way you're going to write this to the Gemara. The Gemara says this idea that you shouldn't marry someone here and then marry someone there because of this chashash. The concept exists in the Gemara, but that's about specifically just marrying another woman in another place. It's not about marrying two women. So he says Rabbi Gershom is taking that Gemara and expanding it a bit and saying that therefore a man should just never marry two women simultaneously. We presume one would be in one place, one would be in the other, but B'chlal we're just going to say don't marry two women. She says this is a big chiddush. This is just the Mishkanis Yaakov. Mishkanis Yaakov is strengthening the Cherem in essence by saying that it's a siyag l'Torah. When it's tamek zayin and devel Torah, it's different than when it's a siyag l'Torah. So quotes other achreinim that say, just because Mishkas Yaakov has this idea doesn't mean that that's taka the geder, the halachic geder. Continues quoting other achreinim that throw other related ideas out of Parnasim. Ram Padwa says, man, Pasha can't afford to support multiple families, it's not financially viable, so that's the reason. Maram Shik says, Shloiloveli de Isser, okay, whatever he's trying to say over there. Then he gets to an interesting explanation, which, if you didn't see it in Svarim, you would think maybe it's come from outside Svarim, not within the Svarim, but from outside the world of Svarim. But he says, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who's a bit of an original thinker, Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes in Shelas Yavitz that the reason for Cherem demystified Gershom Pashat is that Yidden lived in Christian countries. Gershom is essentially when Yadus Ashkenaz begins. 1,000 years ago, that's when the history of Ashkenaz begins. There may have been some Jews here and there before, but as an organized community with Gedolim, with Poskim. That's when you have this organized Jewish community living under European Christians, and European Christians, of course, I didn't look up the history as to where those attitudes came from, but we know that certainly for the last 1,000 years, European Christians have not tolerated marrying more than one woman. That's not a thing. So Yaakov then says that's the real reason for Takanas Rabbeinu Gershom. Sakanal Yehudim that are living among the Goyim. The Goyim, the Christians, they interpret it as like Eishes Ish. So so if the Yidden continued following Yiddishkeit, it would cause strife, it would cause problems. So Rabbeinu Gershom, Shalom min Adin, made this Gzeira. And therefore, wherever Jews do not live among European Christians, Mamela, there's no Sibba Melachatchila for any such Gzeira. There's no Yisaid at all. It's Pashat, we're always ba'inus, we're always under duress by society around us. He says, even though they write other reasons, but this is the real reason. So he's like Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden doesn't deal with it. He's an Ashkenazi saying that. The Ginas Vradim, I believe that's someone from Mitzrayim, says that, Rabbeinu Gershom, it's only for those in Ori Edom. Yad Umas Tekifa. It's due to our connection, our relations with Gentiles. So they're the ones who say this explicitly outright in this context. He says we can find though other Makaitis for this idea in Tshuvas from early on from the Rivash, the Ran, and the Radbaz, who mention in passing what the reality is. Lav dafka they're applying it as a reason, but they mention this reality in passing with regards to what life is like in Europe. The Rivash writes, "Shebemalchus zeh in Catalonia, hanoise isha al ishtoi mechayev reisha lamelech." You're in deep trouble, maybe even the death penalty. Elam keinotul reshus. You have to get special permission, royal permission to marry another woman. So they're acknowledging this reality. There's a tshuva from the Ran. The Ran says, "Kiyesh knas guf u'mamen l'fiyah makubel mitzad ha'malchus." You get in deep trouble. That's for Gerish and Bal Karcha. Those are the two big ones, and those are the two things that Christians absolutely would not tolerate. And again, the Ram repeats it later. What? And this Radbaz as well, quoted in Shut Mari Beirav, also says that He says, the way he says it is either you're makabel takanas b'nei Gershom, or you b'chlal live in a Christian country where you'll be punished anyway. He presents that there as two things, but you see this idea that if you live in these countries, you obviously would not be able to get away with it legally. And he says there's also a remes to this in the Rosh. Rosh says the takana was b'pnei tzedek hashab b'mekaymis. So he wants to interpret that as also alluding to this. So he says, Abazai, not just the Cherem b'nei Gershom, in his, at least in his argument, it's not just the original kavan of Cherem b'nei Gershom. This entire time, all these up until 100 years ago, where Jews are living in fear, without equal rights, or whatever, under anti-Semitic European governments. So that svara never changed. That svara is ongoing. But all the svardim that didn't have that reality, or even today, where perhaps whether or not it's legal to practice polygamy legally on the books, but the governments are certainly not taking a particular interest in whether Jews are practicing or what people's marital situation is, especially if it's just religious and not legal. So essentially, what he's trying to argue and imply here is that the whole Yisoid felt it up a bissel, and Cherem b'nei Gershom isn't necessarily so relevant in this particular context. And he goes through other more recent achreinim. When achreinim Taka did give a heter me'er rabbanim, it's the zelbet problem. How are you going to give a heter me'er rabbanim if legally you're still married? So Taka in a number of tshuvas where they mention heter me'er rabbanim, they add, by the way, you also have to get legal rishos. Goes through a number of makayros that allude to this. So, meaning they knew that even if Allah, even if you the minute heter me'er rabbanim, it's all good, but they wouldn't agree to heter me'er rabbanim unless they knew that everything legally was lined up properly. He says more recently, right? So, like I said, now b'pashtus there's no pachat from the goyim. Elamai, now it's society. It's what are people going to say? He says Rav Unterman was the chief rabbi in Eretz Yisrael. When he's talking about women who are mesarev to come to Beis Din, he writes that, by the way, if you give the husband heter nisuin because she's a veres aldas, he says it gets the women angry. So, like Rav Unterman seems to be aware of that, we have to avoid societal backlash. And in Haisafa, he says, Rav Unterman adds, "Hateirim elu mo'iririm chamas hanoshim ha'iskim b'shivu yischuyas." The people that are for equal rights. B'toynos kischusa shaleisha mekupachas. We're hurting women. So it sounds like Rav Unterman in this day and age has other types of concerns, maybe concerns that maybe as halachas we shouldn't take as seriously in his view. So the Sri Deyesh also says that the b'nei Gershom saved us milag ha'umes she'amru shebedina Yisrael ha'isha nechshavas k'shivcha k'nanis. The Christians say, Jewish women have fewer marital rights, so b'nei Gershom came and saved us from that taina. So argument this person's trying to make here is that this perspective, this background, should give us a different attitude, perhaps, towards how we feel about Cherem b'nei Gershom. That's his argument. Moving on, he gets into the geography of Cherem b'nei Gershom. We touched on that a bit last time, where b'nei Gershom lived, and it spread in other parts of Europe, other Christian parts of Europe, and then there's all the rest of the world, and the places where they had a shvuah, places where they didn't have a shvuah. They taka married Beis Nashim. We spoke about this. You don't have to do that again. But that's also a technical matter that is meaningful to this author. He wants to make the point that Cherem b'nei Gershom doesn't apply in new locations. Like in his view, you can just come and say, there's no Cherem b'nei Gershom here, or something like that. Okay. Now, but Poyal, as we said, many Sfardim, many of the countries we're familiar with, essentially had the Shvuah. So in some sense, it seems like that effectively Ashkenazim and Sephardim have the same situation, the same matzav. Because we have the Cherem demystified Gershom, they think Cherem demystified Gershom technically isn't strong enough, so they have the Shiur. So he says, no. Ashkenaz and Sfarad have a lot of differences. Pashat halacha l'maisa. He says, for example, and he goes through seven dogmas. I don't know if we'll do all seven. He says, for example, minig Ashkenaz, if a woman, chas v'shalom, becomes blind, loses her eyesight in both eyes. So, if you follow Cherem demystified Gershom, we find Rabbanim that say, no, you can't be megarish bal karcha, and no, you can't marry another one, not even het to marry Rabbanim. Why would you give you het to marry Rabbanim? Because she lost her eyesight. Fakar to begach zarias. And even if the man would be mechuyev, even if kaifin the man, like we spoke about the Rosh saying that it should be equal. If you're kaif for the man, it should be kaif for the woman. No, even if it's a circumstance in which we'd be kaif for the man, we wouldn't be kaif for the woman. Mashenka minik Sfarad was quotes a number of Makairas that say that no, it's time for the husband to move on, marry another woman, whatever it is. What if she's a nichbis? What if she has, back then the term was nichbis, what's the condition called today? I'm forgetting the term. Epilepsy, thank you. So today we have a better understanding of it and perhaps keep it under control. Back then it was more of just a mysterious affliction that attacked at random times. People could suddenly have it and then suddenly not have it. So weiter. So Minik Sfarad was to be more lenient, more helpful to the man, and if the woman became a nichbis. And again, in Ashkenaz, they were more strict. Perhaps most interestingly, which is something we've touched on in various shiurim already, the idea of being married for 10 years and not having children. Right? So the original idea is that a husband can marry another woman. That would be a reason. So of course in Minik Sfarad, so he's talking about 10 years go by, no child, taka, go marry another woman. Shenkein in Peiskei Ashkenaz, we've seen over time, I saw someone give a shiur recently Bechlal about the history of being makbid to divorce and remarry. But the idea of, now I have reshus to go, to be over in the Cherem demystified Gershom, so the Rabbi Yehuda, they came to Rabbi Yehuda with a case of 10 years, and he said, no, we're not actually going to be mater unless the husband wants to go to Eretz Yisrael and the woman doesn't want to go. And Beis Shloime, we quoted last year about a number of things. I believe it's Shloime Drimmer. He's also machmir. He says, nowadays you're not going to find anybody that's going to give you a heter to marry another woman because 10 years passed. So the Shalom Eshev was machmir even after 20 years, and it's clear that biologically she can't have children, etc., etc. Because he found one tshuva, Ein Yitzchak, I believe that would be perhaps Bilchan Inspector, Yitzchak Bilchan Inspector, that if it was 40 years, after 40 years, he was mater. Okay, shkayach. Goes on, Meiredas, which is more to the point of what's being discussed here, etc., etc. So just pointing out the differences between Ashkenaz and Sfarad on some of these issues. Then it goes on into the whole question of did the Cherem expire, and what does that mean practically, and does that mean it's weaker now, etc. There's a list of poskim that say, right, that it expired. Fine, okay. Now, what about b'makim mitzvah, right? So the way he set this whole thing up is that a man has a chiyuv p'ru'revu, and if he's no longer with his wife, so he has a mitzvah p'ru'revu, what's he going to do about it? So would the Cherem demystified Gershom be applicable b'makim mitzvah? So you have poskim in the last few hundred years that say that no, it's still Cherem demystified Gershom is still applicable. So here's the big chap, because we actually have Rabbeinu Gershom on the record. Rabbeinu Gershom actually got up a Sgan on this topic. So if you look in the Mordechai and Yavamis, Perek HaCholetz, he writes, Tshuvas Rabbeinu Gershom. husband and wife were married for 5 years. They didn't have children. And not only didn't have children, but also ha'isha dam. She didn't have a period. So it's usually not a good sign if you're hoping to have children. Not that she never did, but leprakim, episodically, but not consistently. Once in 6 weeks here, and this and that. 4 months went by, she didn't see. She thought she was pregnant, but no, nothing. Then again it restarted, then again it stopped, back and forth. The husband's getting upset. He says, "Hine gvuras anoshim li." My equipment's is okay. What's with you? And she says, "You're right." And I thought I was pregnant. Maybe it's your mazel at fault. So Rabbi Gershom responded as follows: The isha zeh yishad eser shalom. Like we mentioned, it's technically halacha doesn't really recognize necessarily. Technically, doesn't recognize until 10 years pass. Otherwise, I was quoting from Mort Chelial, I believe. About today with our scientific understanding of fertility and being infertile, sterile, whether that would be a factor, but that halacha technically only really just acknowledges 10 years. What if the man doesn't have gvuras anashim? That's a related discussion that we were talking about at the time. So Rabbi Gershom says, wait 10 years. For that long you have to wait. And And what if 10 years pass, he doesn't want a divorce? So we have to force him. So that's the tshuva. The tshuva doesn't actually say, no, what if she refuses? Do we force her? But the way the Rosh said it, and the Svara Pshuta, if we force him, we force her. If we're willing to deal with the chashash of get mu'usa and force him, so kol shekain, that whatever chashash there is in forcing her is not as strong. So she's miskadeshes bal karcha. And there's nothing here about a cherem, being matter the cherem. It's not just his own chiddush to read the Rabbi Gershom's shuv in the Mordechai this way. The Tzitz Eliezer says chelik zayin sim ches. So he discovered this Rabbi Gershom. All the achronim missed this Rabbi Gershom. He says now they printed a shut Rabbi Gershom Hagayla. Apparently the tshuva existed independently in Kisvei Yad as well, and now we have it, besides the Mordechai as a secondary source, we also have Sefer Shut Rabbeinu Gershom Hagayla, and you can read it there as well, and I guess there's some shinuyim. So it says everyone missed this tshuva, just no one ever excited it, acknowledged it, responded to it. It says, hey Bazoi, so we see that nobody knew about it, otherwise they would have mentioned it. And there's a klal that if there's a very chashuva tshuva on the record, but it wasn't widespread, it wasn't familiar, and then later, people that come later find themselves in disagreement because they were unfamiliar with it, then you could say that, if they only would have known about this tshuva, they would have changed their mind. Al Rebbe we know uses this svara sometimes. Whether we are supposed to always use this svara in every single situation is another story. But the Tzitz Eliezer cites this tshuva and invokes this rule to say that, maybe this changes the whole calculus. That's about, according to Tzitz Eliezer, according to Rabbi Gershom, we have a beferish Rabbi Gershom about Bal Karcha. That if it's a makim mitzvahs period v'rivya, 10 years, which the Gemara says is a shiur, and then your chiyuv period v'rivya kicks back in, and you know how to remain in this marriage, so Rabbi Gershom zakt, kaifer noisai, so bepashtas kaifer noisai. What about the other cherem, not to marry another woman? We actually have something from Rabbi Gershom on the record as well. Also, a bissel for Varfen, but in the Shut Zichrin Yehuda, Ben Yehuda ben Rosh, he quotes, he says he has a tshuva from Rabbi Gershom. Isha shishasa eser shana meitzel bayla v'layolda nihi she'en kaifin shetitel ksuba v'gita. Here it says that we don't force. Ishlai and how that stems. But matirin lo'elisa acheres. Quote Rabbi Gershom is saying we would be matter, he should marry. That daita dahachi loy gazar. I don't know if this is meant, it's a paraphrase of Rabbi Gershom, because obviously Rabbi Gershom wouldn't refer to himself in third person, but this is what he says, it says there, and that, who discovered this one? The Marsham, Shalom Shvadron of Brezan, writes in Shut Marsham, Chelik Daled, Simon Yutes, that, here's a tshuva that everyone missed. what does Marsham do with the Veisach? But if we take it Tzitz Eliezer, we can say, again, if people only knew what Rabbi Gershom actually said, it's the Chatz from Rabbi Gershom. So that's that particular argument. Even if we didn't have these tshuvas, he claims most Paiskim, Mishanim and Achreinim, say that Rabbi Gershom wasn't Geyser and Makim Mitzvah. And you can't accept the possibility that it is Chal b'Makim Mitzvah. And who's one of the people that says this? One of the people that says this is the Tzemach Tzedek. I believe Rabbi Shuchat already mentioned it, covered it. But we have the Tzemach Tzedek in Shut Eben Esim and Vav, that b'Makim Mitzvah, le'hoisa takanas Rabbeinu Gershom klal, lachen in tzarach klal meir rabbanim. It says you need a heter meir rabbanim when there's a good reason. That's when the takana was chal. But if shah yud shanim v'layod loy chal hatakana. What this person is trying to argue is that if you go with this shit in the case of 10 years, so in the case where the woman walks out, you have to wait 10 years. She's clearly not here. So all those who hold that the Chen ben Gershom doesn't apply after 10 years, Mamela would also work the same way here. Weiter, more along these lines of Makaitis on this Nukud. That's b'makim mitzvah, focusing on the positive side. It needs to be mekayim period. Then there's also the other side of the coin. Being in a situation without a wife is makim aveda, hirhuri aveda, and worse. Quotes different achreinim that say it can't be that Rabbi Gershom's chedem is in a matzav where it's going to lead the man to be nichshel. And Bechlal quotes the Ein Yitzchak again. I believe that's Yitzchak Khan Inspector. Says that the Gedolei Hadar don't have the power to be oiker anything in the Torah. Afil b'sheva al taisa. So if there's an issue of aveda here, then no chedem can stop the man from finding a solution to save him from the aveda, etc., etc. And in this case, his argument is that this is also a makim aveda. She's not here. Whatever the reason is, she's not here anymore. So that's a central plank of his presentation, of his argument. B'chlal, Paiskim, we find, right, just like we saw before, there are cases in which the chedem, not even being mevatel the chedem was never chal. Like we just saw, like Tzemach Tzedek quotes the idea that case of 10 years, the whole chedem was never chal. If the whole chedem is never chal, you don't need a heter meir rabbanim. His understanding of all the discussions in the Paiskim, Mishanim Achreinim is that if Mela they're together, Zainzah, but if they're not together, then there's no Chem de Rabbi Gershom. Yeah, his argument. Then he goes into the whole thing about Bechlal. If a man is stranded without a woman, then it's the dayan, a pasha has a chiyuv to take the man's side. You have to read, chap what these arguments signify and suggest. But that's the case he's trying to make. That you have to pasha the dayan's now. His whole focus, his whole mind has to concentrate now. You have to say that that's the main issue right now in this situation. Okay. Next thing is an interesting question. Lamer Zogan Chem Dovid Gershom does apply. And Lamer Zogan, a person in this matzav should not go ahead, should not marry another woman. Lamer Zogan, he goes ahead and does it anyway. He did the wrong thing, he was over on the chedem. Is the chedem still relevant now? In other words, is it an isser to get married, or every moment that he's married to more than one woman, he's being over on the chedem? So he wants to argue, of course, that it's just at the beginning, but there's no problem behemshech. So it's quoted from different tshuvas, earlier achreinim, the fiyarach. Later achreinim, he concedes, later Ashkenazi Paiskim interpreted it, understood it to mean that no, you're not to remain married to two. Obviously, he's more, siding more with the former, not with the latter. And again, he wants to point out that surely the legal situation, the laws in Europe, surely had a factor here, etc. Here's an interesting question. Let's say you're going to be over in one of the chara. Let's say the conditions demand that one do something about these charamim. Which one is taka kedai to be over or to be matir? Gershom bal karcha or marrying another woman? So as we know, in all the situations, we always talk about a heter me'er rabbanim. So clearly, we're taking a side. We're saying that it's better to marry another woman rather than be megarish bal karcha. But that itself is actually a very interesting question. I mentioned last week I came across an article that one article I found that quotes this Mamagli Tzedek as a mucker, and that article is all about that. Very interesting discussion about the history in Eretz Yisrael. How did the rabbinical judicial system in Eretz Yisrael, because that's essentially how it's built. Right here in America, we tend to think of Rabbanim mostly as ceremonial, and hopefully everyone's life goes according to plan. You don't end up having to deal with Batei Din of Even Ezer. But in Eretz Yisrael, it's a lot more obvious that there's like a rabbinic judicial system that works in parallel to the courts, and they have very strong legal powers. They also conduct themselves and operate like a court system. So there's case files, and it's all, I guess, whatever the laws are, but they're somewhat public knowledge. You can have access. You can access those case files. So this individual wrote a whole Langariches to explore how did the system of Batei Din in Eretz Yisrael, how did they come to the conclusion that it's always heter nisuin and never gershom bal karcha. We're not going to get into that now. Potentially that could be another topic if there's an interest. This person writing about that quotes Mamagli Tzedek here. Mamagli Tzedek says he looked into it, and by his count, it's basically equal. There's half the poskim he saw that acknowledged to address this question say it's better to do gershom bal karcha. About half of them say it's better to marry another woman, and Mamela, according to his conclusion, it's 50-50. Either one, whatever is easier, whatever is more convenient. That should be the one to go with. Obviously, that's not how the Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael went with it. So his argument is of course against what the status quo, halachic status quo is in Eretz Yisrael as well. Back to the previous question. What if a person went ahead and did the wrong thing? They got married, they shouldn't have done it. Is there a vart of being koifa, the man now, to be megarish, his second wife or not? So the Neder Yehuda says, you can't just be koifa. Chinuch ben Gershom is very important, but to stam force a person to divorce, get mu'asa, how are you overcoming those problems? We don't like getting into situations of get mu'asa. And she could be chashash ish and mamzerim that creates its own disasters. So he's making this argument based on his makayas that you wouldn't be able to do anything about it if a person went ahead and found someone who was willing to go ahead with him. And then finally the question of marrying in two places, which is tak even ezer siman beis, that we referred to before, right? So the Gemara says that you shouldn't marry a woman in another country. And Lefi, look in Shulchan Aruch, Even Ezer Siman Beis Sif Yud Aleph, it says, La yisa adam isha medina zu v'yelech v'yisa isha acheres medina acheres, shama yizdavgu avanim zel lezeh v'nimtza ach ne'esei achesei, v'adam gadol sheshmoi yedua v'zarim afersam achrav mutter. Now the question is, what if a person's wife passed away? What if they got divorced? Is it sad to say that it applies across the board? Because what's the chashash? The chashash is having two families. An ach from this family might marry an achas from that family. Why do we care if he's still married to the first one or not still married to the first one? The idea is, you went to Medina Acheres, they don't have information about this Medina. Fast forward 25 years, the father died, whatever happened, and an ach can marry an achas. So according to a literal understanding of this, it would actually never be mutter for a man to marry a second woman, even if he's an alman, v'chulu, and another. So the Beis Meir, talking here in Seven Beis, though, says, no. It's only b'neisei isha al ishtoi, not b'meisa and his gash. Well, he has children. There weren't geyser. Beis Meir also says that, if he's an alman, he'll probably take his small children with him to his new marriage, but that's a shvacha svara. So it says, Aruch HaShulchan, and Siman Aleph says that L'maisa, we never saw that anybody is makbid, an alman, a gorosh, no one ever mentioned, by the way, it's often a gemara, often a Shulchan Aruch, you have to get married in another country. He says, because we're so few among the nations, and every year the Gemara said, the Shulchan Aruch said, if you're mefursem, right, everyone knows, it's the children of the chashva person, so and so. Then everyone's always going to know that they're both the children of so and so. He says every year it's a mefursem. That's what the Aruch HaShulchan says. That's also something that we can discuss and question, but it's a very interesting nekuda. And I guess, again, this person is trying to make the argument that we could somehow use these svaras in this situation as well. Okay, we really have to finish over here. In conclusion, he talks about, what are the standards, right? A husband's coming to Beis Din and he says, I want a heter. How strong does his case have to be? So he wants to make the argument that the Edom don't have to be Edom Cherem, it doesn't have to be in front. He brings Achrein that say that it's not even in front of it's not a Cheshem Mishpat child, it's not a din of dvarim between two tzaddim. I was thinking when I saw this that L'chayr that Tzemach Tzedek and Siman Aleph that we discussed I think 2 weeks ago is Zaman Fakart, because Tzemach Tzedek wrote to the different Nechemia, and Tzemach Tzedek said that even though Shafait Ben Achechem Ksev, even though really I would have to speak to both sides, but since you're reaching out to me to complain, I'll explain what I think. So from the Tzemach Tzedek is Af Shemashma that it is like a more of a Cheshem Mishpat type of thing. But we find this argument that it's not in other situations where Lav Dafka, let's say nowadays, talk about mastering someone. You have to hear both sides, or do we say, no, it's a sakana shayla, it's not a chayesha mishpat, two sides question, so you don't have to hear both sides. That's the type of discussion you have. So some argue that for this type of thing you wouldn't need to hear the other side. Meir Rabbanim, he gets into the Meir Rabbanim, obviously doesn't think Meir Rabbanim is so important. V'chulu. Anyway, so that gives you a very general sense of a lot of the interesting nekudas here, or what this person considers to be the holes or the weaknesses in the Cherem de Gershom. And B'chalal, he wants to say that, who's to say that, why does someone look at Cherem de Gershom as such a har bezach? Maybe it's not a har bezach, maybe it's just another thing. V'chulu. He actually has a chelik beis. In the chelik beis, he focuses on the financial aspects, and he also makes a lot of perhaps radical arguments about what the husband's chiyuvim are or aren't. But I'll leave that all to you if you're interested. If you're interested in any of the nekudas that came up here, I'm happy to elaborate or show you the expanded version of these arguments. In conclusion, we should be zeichet to learn Torah Lishma. None of this should be relevant and applicable to anyone. Good Shabbos.